body transformed from our lowly body. Amen to that too, right? A glorious body. Or what about like the homes we reside in? Most people want a better home than they have, or at least, that one thing that's kind of in heaven. If it's destroyed here on earth, we've got a beautiful building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. When we think about our lives and we think deeply, I don't want us to forget to think deeply about where we're going as Christians. It's kind of the driving factor, isn't it? I'm not ashamed to say, or when I hear people say that, I'm a Christian because I want to go to heaven. Well, right on, right? Yeah. Salvation has been given to us. Why? So that we can be back with God for eternity. And it's going to be cool. It's going to be so cool. I don't know how to tell you it's going to be cool, but when I was a kid, I always tried to, back and forth off of my parents and be like, what's heaven going to be like? How do you describe that to a kid, right? And so I'd start saying, well, I'm pretty sure it's going to be like ice cream and candy, and you're never going to have a tummy ache, and you're always going to want more. It's going to be amazing. Yeah? I mean, is that wrong, right? We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but we do know it's going to look glorious. It's going to be 24/7 singing. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And apparently we're not going to be tired because we got glorious bodies. And it's going to be tearless and glorious and connected to God like we've always desired, but we haven't been able to have because we sinned. But he gave us that opportunity in heaven. You believe it? That's why we're here, right? Yeah, we believe it. We sing about it. I love the phrasing of this song. Just listen to the lyrics, right? Land beyond, so far and bright, land beyond where there is no night. Summer land, God is the light. Happy summer land of bliss. That's an oldie. I was trying to find it for the slides, and I don't know the last time we sang that here. That's an oldie but a goodie, isn't it? How do you describe to humans what heaven's going to be like? Well, it's like a summer land of bliss. Sitting here in January sounding like that would be good anytime, Lord, right? Happy summer land of bliss. Oh, heaven's going to be awesome. Heaven is what we look forward to, and it's why we are Christians for some degree, right? It's a driving factor. In fact, I would say that we've been given heaven as a promised land. If you become a Christian and you are serving God and you've been given the gift, what is the gift? Well, the gift is the promised land, right? That's why I used those scriptures this morning, was to point out the fact that we get a little physical taste for us as humans of what it might look like. It might look like a better country. It might look like a better house, and it's definitely going to look like better bodies. But for Christians, what we need to remember is, at the end of it all, we have a promised land ahead of us. A promised land in eternity that is heaven. So I want us to think about that a little bit today. But you might be thinking that I chose this title, A Promised Land, and I'm talking about heaven. But you might recognize that title, right? Promised Land. Is that in the Bible anyplace else? Dare I say it's in most of the Old Testament, right? And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go ahead and read Genesis through Deuteronomy, because that's all about the Promised Land. So buckle in, let's go. Okay, I can't do that. I don't have time for that. The Promised Land is a theme throughout a good portion of the Old Testament, right? And it starts all the way back in Genesis. And so I want to talk about this Old Testament Promised Land, and then I want to talk about our Promised Land again at the end. But all the way back in Genesis, we start to see a glimpse of a promised land from God. Genesis chapter 12, the first book of the Bible, one of the first, dare I say, main characters, long-term characters of the Bible is Abraham. And we have this promise from God to Abraham in Genesis 12, verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram, and he said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. That's just kind of a glimpse of the land promise that God has given Abram at this time. Also get a little more fleshed out on it in chapter 15, just three chapters later here. Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your offspring I give this land, from of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." Probably said some of those wrong. This land has been promised to Abram. A promised land, right? And the reason I didn't put all those names up there is because they're important, but they're also not important, right? It helps us identify the land, where it's at, but also the point that I want to drive home today is it was promised. There was indeed a promised land. All the way back towards the beginning of the Bible, God's people had a promised land given to them, but they didn't have it yet. Abram was told his descendants would have this land, but he didn't have it yet. And I promise you, I really want to read you the rest of Genesis, Exodus, all of these, right? But I can't. So, if you know the story, Abram and his people will be known the Israelites. And we follow the Israelites a long ways throughout their story, right? Some of the most famous stories that we might teach in like kids' classes and Sunday school are from the Israelites, God's people, the descendants of Abraham. And like I said, I can't go through all of this, but you might remember some parts of this story. They end up in a land called Egypt. We already get a little glimpse of that, right? The Israelites, the descendants. There's lots more characters in between here too, right? They end up in a land of Egypt. And it's great. Things are good. They have a promised land that they are working towards, and they are God's people. But it doesn't always stay great, does it? God's people, the Israelites, are in Egypt, and you know what happens? A bad king comes in. And he says, man, all of these Israelites are here in Egypt, and they're not Egyptians. We better squash them. And he says, I don't want them to overpopulate. I don't want them to have any more children. And I'm skipping a lot of details here, right? But basically the idea is these people cannot rule my kingdom, so they should be slaves. And by the time we get to, Numbers, actually, no, I'm ahead of myself here. I'm sorry. I'm still in Exodus. By the time we get to Exodus chapter 1, we see them enslaved. We see them tortured. We see them being killed. But God's got a plan. One of those characters I'm kind of skipping over here is another guy named Moses, right? He's another one of those stories that we tell kids in Sunday school. Moses is God's plan for these people, these Israelites, who are stuck in slavery in Egypt. And man, the story of Moses is full of lots of ups and downs. First off, this guy, Moses, shouldn't have even been born. He should have been born and then immediately killed. I'm sorry. But yeah, that's what should have happened to him. But God had a plan for him to be a part of the Egyptian royal family in his deliverance from being killed. That's his origin. So God says, Moses is going to be the guy that I'm going to use to bring the nation of Israel to their promised land, even though they're slaves in Egypt. And what does Moses say as an adult man now? Nope. Right? God, I don't talk very good. You should pick somebody else. And God's got to do a lot. And in fact, this is even when we see God getting, dare I say, frustrated and angry with someone. It's Moses. But God's got a plan, right? And through finally getting Moses to cooperate, and through finally getting Pharaoh to cooperate with a whole lot of plagues, what do we get when we get to Exodus chapter 2? Get out of here, Israelites. You're not supposed to be here. Go to your promised land. And Moses is their leader. So they head on out of Egypt to go to the promised land. Man, it was a long time ago that Abram got a promise from God. When are we going to get to our promised land? Well, we're free from Egypt. Let's go. Also some drama in that, right? Pharaoh changes his mind and he decides, I'm going to go kill everybody on their way out. God takes care of that. Moses is a leader, and they are on their way to the promised land. God had a plan for him. God had a plan for him, but man, has it already taken a long time. It took a lot of slavery, and it took a lot of work, and now we're out here running away, but we're going to the promised land because that was God's plan for us. Do you ever feel like that's life? God's got a promised land for us, right? We talked about a house made in heaven. We talked about a country better than any on this land. We talked about new bodies that don't hurt and are glorious. But right now, if you're sitting in this room, you're just running away from slavery to try and get to the promised land. Life is long sometimes to get there, isn't it? I haven't even told you the best part of the story yet. You already know it's there, right? They get to the promised land. They get to the promised land, and they're like, cool. And Moses says, cool, this is what God promised. Let's go check it out. And so what do? It's a kid's song, right? 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. So they send the spies into Canaan, the land that was promised by God. I'm skipping a lot of details. And what do they do when they come back? Well, they say, man, it's awesome. It's awesome. Here, let me read you for Numbers chapter 13. Again, I skipped books of the Bible basically here, but I had to tell you the quick story. Numbers chapter 13, what do they say when they get back? Verse 27, 28, they told them, we came to the land which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey. And this is its fruit, giant, glorious fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and their cities are fortified and very large. 12 men went to go spy on Canaan. They come back and they say, wow, it's awesome. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. And it's got fruit. That sounds delicious. That sounds incredible. It sounds lush, beautiful. But also, they got big people in big cities, and they're scary. But God promised this land, right? He promised them this. This is where he led them to. This was the promised land. So they say it's beautiful, but also they say in 31, the men who'd gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against these people. They are stronger than we are. We're scared. They're too big. So the promised land that God had given them is they finally get there and they say, but we're scared. Oh yeah, and they wandered for 40 years because of it. They got to the promised land and they were too scared, so God said what? Well, Numbers chapter 14, the next chapter, verses 32 through 35. But for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness. Your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness, according to the numbers of days in which you spent out in the land. 40 days, a year for each day. You shall bear the iniquity for 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this I will do to all this wicked generation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to a full end, and they shall all die. We're too scared. Fine, says God. Go in the wilderness and die. 40 years. He said it 4 times. 40 years. You ever feel like life is just like 40 plus years wandering through the wilderness? It was tough. It's the desert. They whined, they struggled. God still provided. He gave them manna and quail and drink and a leader Moses. And guidance by God in the form of a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, or UFOs as Greg calls them. We'll talk about that more later. God was still with them. God was still guiding them, but they were wandering in a wilderness for 40 years. Sometimes we feel like we're wandering in a wilderness for 40 years, don't we? We're following God. We see the pillar of cloud. We know what we're about. We know there's a promised land, but man, is it a long life to get there. And so it's kind of a controversial idea. Some people disagree with me on the internet. Ever heard of that happening before? But I like to look at the nation of Israel as kind of a comparison to our lives. We have a promised land. They had a promised land. They had a promised land flowing with milk and honey. My heaven is flowing with ice cream and candy, but okay, I'll take it. But sometimes this life sure feels like wandering in the wilderness, escaping slavery, and doing the best I can with what I have. I'm going to keep following God, but I sure feel like it's a wilderness. But it was still a promised land, wasn't it? A generation had to die. Why? Because they were too scared and they were faithless to the Lord. Something I want us to remember is that the promised land has been promised to us. We shouldn't doubt that. Doubting is what got them into more wandering, more journeying. Don't doubt what God has promised. He is faithful, no matter how scary it looks ahead. All right, I have no idea where I am in my notes. 40 years, Okay. At the end of this whole story, like I said, I can't tell you the whole story. But by the end of the story, they do indeed get the promised land. And as I said, there's a lot of Old Testament we can study about. If you did the one-year Bible, you see the continuing story. It's a long story, right? But they finally get to the land. And even when they get to the land, they have to do a lot of work to reside there, if you will. But the promised land was always promised, and it was never taken away, even though generations had to pass, even though wandering had to go 40 plus years. If you feel like you're wandering, remember, the promise remains. If you follow God, you are going to the promised land. Don't forget it. Be encouraged by that, because sometimes we can get so caught up in wandering in the wilderness that we forget that we're going to the promised land. But there's a really weird part of this story. That's super encouraging. There's a really weird part. A lot of preachers, and we don't like to talk about this weird part at the end, because who was leading everybody through the wilderness and was the right-hand man of God? Moses, right? So they get to the promised land, and Moses is the first in the door, right? No. Actually, Moses doesn't get to go. By the time we get to Deuteronomy, again, powered through most of the Old Testament here. By the time we get to the end of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, listen what God tells Moses. Verses 48 through 52, basically the last bit of the chapter. That very day the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go up on this mountain, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, opposite of Jericho, to view the land of Canaan, the promised land, that I am giving to the people of Israel for a possession. And go up onto that mountain and die. And be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. Because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel, at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, and because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel. For you shall see the land before you, but you shall not go there. Into the land I am giving to the people of Israel, you shall not go there." How many sermons you heard about Moses not being allowed to go? We don't want to talk about that. What? Moses. He got the people out of Egypt. Moses, he led them the whole way. Moses, he put up with all their crap. And yet he gets there, and God says, "Go up on the mountain, look at the promised land that you don't get to go into." What? Why? Why was Moses not permitted to enter into the land that was promised? Did you catch it? You broke faith with me in the midst of the wilderness. And because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel, you shall not see the land before you. What did he do exactly? Well, we get little pieces of the story, but what he did was he broke faith and he broke trust in the Lord. Even though he led the people there, even though he was strong and he was God's right-hand man and those were God's people, he still didn't get to enter. So I want you to know that we have a promised land. We have a promise. It's promised. It's a guarantee. It's heaven. But Moses didn't get to enter. That means we might not get to enter if we break faith with God and we break trust in God. That's what we were talking about in Bible class this morning, is trusting in God. How do we do that? How do we cast our anxieties? Well, I want to challenge us that we cannot be the ones that end up like Moses with a broken faith with God when the promised land arrives. Now, you might be a little concerned. I'm definitely not preaching a once saved, always saved sermon right here at the very end. A lot of debates about that, right? But I do want you to think deeply about how we do have a promised land, but how Moses didn't get to go in. Why should we think about these sermons? All these sermons are for you to think and not to listen. But why should we think about what our values are as we walk in this life? Well, because I want to make sure my values hold faith in God and trust in Him, because I want to enter the promised land. Why should we self-reflect and self-examine? Well, because I want to make sure that I'm keeping the faith with God and trusting in God, because I am excited to enter the promised land. This is kind of the recap of all the sermons, in case you haven't got it. I'm excited to enter into the promised land. I'm going to be there, and you're going to be there. You're going to be there, and I'm going to be there. But we got to keep on keeping on. When we get frustrated at God, we got to not break faith. We got to remain trustworthy in Him, because He's promised us a land beyond the skies, a great summer land. And I'm excited to see you there. So let's keep it on. Let's keep focused on the promised land ahead, because I sure don't want to be sitting here in a room with anybody that ends up like Moses, because, man, that's tough. Promised land is ahead. But we got to live the life to get there. And we got to live our dash. There you go, the last sermon. I knew I was missing one. We got to live our dash to get there, right? All of them come together here at the end of January. So, I'll see you there in the promised land. Dustin?